1951. A Senate hearing goes live on television, and America expects to finally see the face of organized crime. Frank Costello sits under the lights, answers in a calm voice, and then forces the camera to change. No violence, no courtroom, just one quiet move that turns exposure into power. In the early 1950s, America was learning a new habit: watching power live. Television was no longer a luxury in a few storefront windows. It was moving into living rooms, onto kitchen counters, into bars where men who never voted still argued about politics. And for the first time, the country could see the government interrogate people in real time, hear the pauses, the evasions, the controlled anger that mattered, because the post-war United States was anxious. Soldiers were home, cities were growing fast, money was moving faster. And behind the official story of prosperity, there was another economy: cash-only businesses, backroom unions, protection payments, gambling rooms that never closed. People had always suspected it existed. They just didn't have a face for it. Then the Senate decided to provide one. In 1950, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee launched a wide investigation into organized crime. The hearings weren't the first government inquiry into corruption, and they weren't the first time politicians used crime as a headline, but they became something else: a national broadcast event. Cameras, bright lights, microphones, a raised desk for senators, and a chair placed in the open like a stage mark. Suddenly, organized crime stopped being an underworld rumor and started sounding like a structure, like a system with rules, leadership, and reach. The committee's message was blunt. This wasn't just a few violent men. This was a network that touched police departments, unions, judges, businesses, and elections. And to sell that message, they needed a symbol. Not a street killer, not a low-level bookie. They wanted someone who looked like the real thing. A man who could plausibly sit in a Manhattan restaurant and talk with bankers, who could walk into a hotel lobby and be treated like a guest of honor, who could make phone calls that changed outcomes without ever raising his voice. They wanted Frank Costello. Costello was not the loud type. He didn't build his legend on public brutality. His reputation, especially among politicians and police who'd been around long enough to know, was that he operated like a broker. He preferred influence over fear, favors over funerals, relationships over headlines. Even his enemies described him with a word that should have been impossible for a gangster: respectable. That was precisely the danger, because the Kefauver hearings weren't just trying to catch criminals. They were trying to educate the public, create pressure, force reform, and prove that the government was not asleep at the wheel. They needed the average viewer to believe this was real, organized, disciplined. And if Costello sat under those lights and looked calm, looked intelligent, looked like a businessman, then the committee's story became stronger. The mob wasn't a rumor anymore. It was wearing a suit. But from Costello's perspective, the risk was even larger than his own case. A live televised hearing wasn't just a courtroom-style threat. It was a new weapon that didn't require a conviction. It could damage the entire model. For decades, the underworld survived on a simple advantage: invisibility. People could suspect, but they couldn't point. Journalists could print accusations, but those accusations still felt like stories. Police could arrest a few soldiers, but the leadership stayed behind layers of deniability. No documents, no minutes, no public memberships. Even when names circulated, faces didn't. Television attacked that advantage directly. A camera didn't need a guilty verdict, it needed an image. A face becomes a fact in the public mind. Once America could watch a man answer questions, once they could study his expression, his posture, the way he reacted under pressure, organized crime stopped being an abstract enemy and started being a person. And a person can be hunted by prosecutors, by ambitious politicians, by reporters, by rival crews who see weakness. This is the problem Costello walked into. How do you survive a public trial that isn't legally a trial, but socially functions like one? He couldn't treat it like a normal subpoena. In a courtroom, you fight evidence and procedure. In a Senate hearing broadcast nationwide, you fight perception. The viewers are the jury, and the verdict happens instantly in millions of private rooms before any judge rules on anything. Costello also had another problem. He was not being summoned as a nobody. He was being summoned as a representative. Whatever he looked like on that screen would become the look of the Mafia in the American imagination. That cut both ways. If he looked vicious, he confirmed fear and justified crackdowns. If he looked polished, he made the organization seem sophisticated, possibly more dangerous because it looked integrated into everyday life. If he looked rattled, he signaled vulnerability. If he looked defiant, he invited escalation. Every option had a cost, and there were costs beyond Washington. Back in New York, power inside the underworld was never frozen. The 1950s were not a calm decade for the old networks. Post-war rackets were changing. Federal attention was growing. Rivalries were constantly recalculating. A boss who appeared weak on national television could become a boss whose phone stops ringing. Allies start protecting themselves. Competitors start planning. Because in that world, legitimacy is a currency, and the Senate was about to devalue it in public. So Costello's strategy could not be simply say nothing. Silence is rarely neutral. Silence can be read as guilt, arrogance, contempt, fear, and there was a legal angle too. If he refused to cooperate, he risked contempt charges. If he cooperated too much, he created leads. If he pleaded the fifth too often, he looked like a man hiding a mountain. If he answered cleanly, he could still be trapped by a single contradiction later, because hearings weren't a single conversation. They were a series of questions designed to be replayed. This was the new battlefield, not the street, not a smoky back room, but a brightly lit stage where the government controlled the framing and the audience supplied the pressure. Now add one more element, the camera itself. Television in the early 1950s was intimate. Grainy, high contrast, close enough to feel like you were in the room. A photograph in a newspaper can be ignored. A moving image is harder to dismiss. People don't just read it, they experience it. They study it, they argue about it, they remember it. That means the smallest details can become the story. The way a man hesitates before answering, the way he holds a cigarette, the way he grips the armrest when a question lands too close to the truth, the way his confidence cracks for a fraction of a second and then returns. Costello understood that, maybe not as a media theorist but as a survivor who'd spent decades reading rooms. He knew that perception isn't built only by words, it's built by what the room feels like when you enter it, and the Senate hearing room was a room he did not control. So the central question becomes simple, and it's not about a single gangster. When the underworld built on shadow and plausible deniability gets dragged into the light of mass media, what does it do? Does it fight the light and risk looking guilty? Does it embrace the light and risk creating a permanent public target? Does it try to outsmart the frame? Costello's appearance at the Kefauver hearings forced a decision that organized crime had avoided for a generation, whether to remain a secret society or adapt into something that could survive public attention. Because after the hearings, nothing would go back to normal. Even if no one went to prison that day, the rules were changing. The government had discovered the power of televised pressure. The public had discovered the entertainment of watching powerful men squirm, and criminals had discovered a new vulnerability, not being caught, but being seen. This is why the hands matter. Not as a gimmick, not as trivia, but as a micro-decision made under pressure, with consequences far beyond that room. A decision about what the audience gets to own. A decision about whether the state gets your face, or only your presence. In the next part, we'll step into the hearing itself, how Costello arrived, what the committee wanted from him, and why the simplest-looking move in the room became the most modern kind of power play, controlling the image without ever touching the microphone. The hearing room had its own rhythm, papers shuffling, chairs scraping, the low murmur of staffers leaning in to pass notes. But the real sound, the one everyone felt, was the hum of equipment, hot lights, cables, a camera perched like an unblinking witness. In 1951, that camera still carried novelty, but the people in the room already understood what it meant. Whatever happened here would not stay here. Frank Costello walked in wearing the kind of suit that didn't announce itself, dark, well-cut, expensive in a quiet way. He didn't enter like a street boss, he entered like a man used to being expected, and that was exactly what the committee wanted, because it made their point for them. They weren't just chasing murders or bookmaking, they were chasing influence. Kefauver's staff had studied the ecosystem. Gambling money turned into legitimate investments. Labor disputes turned into leverage. A politician's campaign turned into a favor owed. Costello's name kept surfacing at the intersections, not as a trigger man, but as a connector. A man who didn't need to threaten everyone, because enough people already wanted to stay on his good side. So when he sat down, it wasn't only a witness taking a chair, it was the idea of the underworld taking a seat under federal lights. But Costello didn't sit like a man waiting to be captured. He sat like a man calculating what the room could take from him and what it couldn't. The senators began the way hearings always begin. Simple questions that sound harmless. Your name, your address, your business. Questions designed to establish a baseline and then tighten the circle. The trap is never the first question. The trap is the 10th one, when the witness forgets how many millions are watching and answers out of habit. Costello answered where he could. He dodged where he had to. And then the real battle started, not between Costello and the committee, but between Costello and the camera. Because the camera wasn't neutral. It didn't just record, it framed. It chose what America would remember. And the committee understood that framing was power. They didn't need to prove Costello ran a nationwide syndicate in that moment. They needed the audience to feel that he did. So the goal was to keep him visible, keep him human, keep him readable. A face is readable. A face gives you fear, arrogance, contempt, humor. A face gives you the little tells, the smirk when a question is weak, the quick blink when a question is dangerous. A face makes the witness real, and Costello knew the same thing. He had spent decades living in an environment where the most dangerous commodity wasn't money, it was identification. Names traveled, descriptions traveled, but a clear image, an image that could be replayed, studied, passed from hand to hand, that was something else. That was permanence. So at some point, the negotiation began. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It happened in the small movements that precede a confrontation. A glance toward the camera, a slight turn of the chair, a quiet exchange between attorneys and staff. The committee wanted his face. Costello did not. In a normal setting, you can refuse to answer. In this setting, refusing to be seen was its own statement, and yet Costello pushed for it anyway. Whether through legal counsel, a demand made off mic, or a refusal to cooperate with the broadcast unless conditions changed, the pressure landed on the committee. Do you risk losing the witness, risking a public fight over procedure, or do you compromise and keep the show moving? And then it happened, the moment that looks almost absurd if you don't understand power. The camera moved, not dramatically, not like a film shot, just a controlled tilt downward, a reframing, a decision made in seconds, a broadcast compromise that turned into a symbol. America didn't get Frank Costello's face. America got his hands, two hands resting on the table, shifting slightly as questions tightened, fingers interlaced, then separating, a knuckle tapping once, then stopping. The small, unconscious gestures of a man under a spotlight who refused to give the spotlight what it wanted most. It was a 5-second move, maybe less, to change the angle and lock it in, and it was one of the most consequential 5 seconds in the history of public organized crime, because it created an entirely new kind of spectacle, the invisible man who was still present. The senators continued, and Costello continued. Viewers listened to the same voice, the same answers, the same evasions, but without the face, the audience was forced to imagine him, and what people imagine is often larger than what they're shown. To some, the absence looked like arrogance. Who does this man think he is, refusing to show his face to the United States Senate? To others, it looked like power. He can bend the room, he can force a camera to look away. Either way, the committee lost something it had counted on, the ability to make him visually small. And that mattered, because the hearings were designed to shrink the underworld, to pull it into the daylight, and reduce it to something the public could condemn without fear. But when the broadcast showed only hands, the underworld didn't shrink. It became a shadow again, an outline instead of a captured image. Costello had turned visibility into ambiguity. Think about the psychological effect. If you see a man's face under interrogation, you can decide whether he looks scared. If you see only hands, you study the hands the way people study evidence. Every twitch becomes a clue. Every pause becomes a possibility. The audience starts doing what investigators do, reading micro-signals, projecting motives, trying to solve him. In other words, the hearing became a case file, not a public humiliation, and that shift protected more than Costello's vanity. It protected the Mafia's operating model. Because in the old system, bosses survived by being hard to pin down, not only legally, but socially. They weren't supposed to become household images. Once you become an image, you become a target that can be organized against. Communities unite. Politicians run on your name. Agents build careers chasing your silhouette. Costello's hands-only broadcast slowed that process. It denied America the easy poster. At the same time, it gave Costello a subtle advantage inside the room. A man who believes he is being watched behaves differently. A face on camera creates self-consciousness. Costello removed that pressure. Not entirely. He still knew he was being heard, but he was no longer being visually dissected in real time. He regained a sliver of privacy in a public proceeding, which is a rare resource when the state is trying to corner you. Now the committee had to adjust. Without facial reactions, they leaned harder into words, into contradictions, into the sound of evasion. They pressed him about his income, his associations, his trips, his relationships with known figures. They framed questions so that a refusal sounded like an admission. They tried to force him into a performance, anger, defiance, something that would play on television even without a face. But Costello's style was not performance. It was steadiness. He didn't rant. He didn't pound the table. He gave the committee the minimum required to keep moving, and he saved his real energy for the long game, leaving the room without giving prosecutors a clean line to follow. This is where the cover-up theme becomes more than a metaphor. In Costello's world, cover-up wasn't only destroying evidence, it was controlling what counted as evidence in the public mind. A photograph can be evidence. A televised close-up can be evidence. A look of panic can be evidence. A smirk can be evidence. Even when it proves nothing in court, it proves something to the country. It creates pressure that generates investigations, that generate witnesses, that generate cases. Costello's 5-second move didn't erase his voice from the record, but it minimized the most viral piece of material the hearings could have produced, the face of a mafia boss, captured and replayed, and outside that room, everyone was watching for different reasons. Federal agencies watched to measure vulnerability. Could he be rattled? Could he be isolated? Could he be turned? Rival crews watched to see whether he looked weak enough to challenge or strong enough to avoid. Politicians watched to see which way the wind was blowing. Newspapers watched to see what the public would react to. And the public? The public watched because it felt like permission. Permission to look at a hidden world without entering it. Permission to judge powerful men who normally never sat in a chair and answered questions. But because the camera showed hands, the public didn't get closure. They got tension. That tension had an odd effect. It kept organized crime in the conversation longer. A clear face might have made Costello seem like just another man in a suit. Hands only made him feel like a figure, almost a myth, someone important enough to negotiate the terms of his own exposure. It wasn't that the Senate lost. The hearings still damaged reputations. They still educated the public. They still increased pressure on law enforcement and helped shift the national mood toward crackdowns. But in that exact exchange, camera versus witness, Costello proved a lesson the Underworld would carry forward. If you can't stop the spotlight, you change the angle, and that's the turning point. Not because it ended investigations, but because it taught both sides a new reality. The government learned television could be a weapon. The Mafia learned television could be survived if you treated it like a negotiation instead of a threat. In the next part, we'll follow the ripple effects, how that hands-only broadcast changed the public's mental image of the Mafia, how it influenced prosecutors and rivals, and why a decision that looked like a small act of stubbornness became a blueprint for hiding in plain sight. The ripple started immediately, because television doesn't just report an event, it distributes a feeling. In diners and living rooms, people didn't say, "I watched a Senate committee today." They said, "I saw it." And what they saw was something oddly unsettling, a man who sounded calm, even polite, answering the United States government while refusing to give the country his face. That absence turned into a story of its own. Newspapers still printed his name, Radio still summarized the exchanges, but the broadcast image, the thing people carried in their heads, was those hands, steady hands, patient hands, hands that didn't look like the hands of a corner thug. They looked like the hands of someone who'd spent his life signing off on decisions, and the public reaction split in a way that mattered. One side saw it as proof of guilt and contempt, a gangster hiding, a criminal too cowardly to show himself. They wanted the government to hit harder, prosecute more aggressively, stop playing games. For them, the hands were infuriating because they felt cheated. They'd tuned in for a face-to-face confrontation, and instead they got a half shadow and a voice. The other side, quietly and sometimes reluctantly, saw it as proof of power, because normal people don't negotiate with the United States Senate on live television. Normal people don't force the most important camera in the room to look away. Even if viewers hated him, many of them still felt the same thing. This man is connected enough to bend rules in public. That feeling was poison for the committee's goal. Kefauver wanted to convince America that organized crime could be confronted, exposed and reduced to something manageable. But the hands-only broadcast suggested a different message. The underworld could adapt. It could take the hit and still protect what mattered. And what mattered wasn't pride, it was insulation. Costello's whole survival strategy depended on being hard to attach to specific crimes. He didn't want a heroic narrative. He wanted ambiguity. Ambiguity was his shield, legally, politically, socially. A boss without a public face is easier for respectable people to deny knowing. A boss without a public face is harder for jurors to emotionally recognize. A boss without a public face is harder for rivals to publicly brand as the main target. The hands move didn't make him invisible, but it kept him from becoming a simple poster. The second ripple was inside law enforcement and politics, where the lesson was cold and practical. Modern organized crime could not be fought only with old tools. The hearings produced leads, publicity and momentum, but they also exposed a weakness in the government's strategy. Public exposure wasn't the same as proof. The committee could raise suspicion and outrage, but it couldn't automatically translate that into convictions, and Costello, sitting behind that compromise, played the gap. He understood something prosecutors always fear. Even when the whole country knows, the law still demands that you prove. A televised hearing can make a man famous. It can make him hated, but it can't by itself put him away forever. So Costello treated the hearings like weather. Loud, dangerous weather, but something to survive, not something to win. And then he did what mattered most. He walked out with the core of his network still intact. There were consequences, of course. The committee pressed him repeatedly, and when he refused to answer certain questions, it wasn't just a public embarrassment, it became a legal problem. Costello was cited for contempt of Congress after refusing to cooperate fully, and he eventually served time. The headlines called it a victory for the Senate, but even that victory had an angle if you looked at it from Costello's world. Prison time is a cost. Public exposure is a structural threat. Costello could pay the cost. He could not allow the structural threat to become permanent. And that's why the camera angle mattered more than the sentence. Time can be survived. A public identity, fully captured, fully displayed, endlessly replayed, can haunt you and everyone tied to you. The third ripple was internal, in the underworld itself, where the viewing wasn't entertainment. It was assessment. Rivals didn't need America to see his face. They already knew what he looked like. What they wanted to know was something more valuable. Did he crack? Did he lose control? Did he look weak enough to invite a move? And what they saw was not weakness. They saw discipline, not heroic discipline, not noble discipline, strategic discipline, the kind that tells other predators, I'm not panicking, I'm still calculating. That matters because the 1950s were full of quiet succession math. Power in organized crime was shifting, and men were testing the edges. You didn't need a declared war to take someone's influence. Sometimes you only needed a moment where they looked exposed. Costello refused to give them that moment on the country's biggest stage. Now here's the twist. The hands-only broadcast didn't just protect Costello. It helped create the modern Mafia myth that would later become a curse. By keeping faces and structures blurred, the underworld stayed half legend, half reality. That made it easier for some politicians to pretend it wasn't real until it was politically useful to say it was. It made it easier for some officials to treat it as an Italian problem instead of a national corruption problem. And it made the Mafia feel to the public like a shadow government rather than an ordinary criminal enterprise. That shadow image gave the organization short-term protection, but it also made future crackdowns more intense. Because once the country finally got undeniable proof, names, ranks, ceremonies, insiders testifying, the backlash wasn't just legal, it was cultural. This is why this moment is a turning point. It's not that Costello's hands saved the Mafia in one dramatic afternoon, as if one camera angle stopped federal pressure. The truth is more interesting. The hands' move showed the Mafia how to survive the age of mass media for a little longer. It was an early blueprint for media-era cover-up. Don't only hide crimes, hide the story shape. Don't only avoid evidence, avoid becoming a simple image. Don't only deny involvement, deny the audience closure, because closure mobilizes people. Ambiguity exhausts them. And that blueprint would be repeated again and again in different forms. Lawyers learning to manage optics, public figures refusing questions while appearing calm, organizations controlling press access, controlling photographs, controlling what the public can emotionally attach to. Costello's move belonged to that lineage, an old-world operator adapting to a new-world weapon. But the most important consequence wasn't on television screens. It was in the minds of everyone who watched power collide with visibility. The government learned that exposure creates momentum, but momentum isn't proof. The public learned that organized crime wasn't only violence, it was influence and insulation. And the underworld learned something it would never forget. The camera is a threat, but it can also be negotiated. That's the real case file conclusion here. When the spotlight hit, Costello didn't swing at it. He didn't beg it to go away. He redirected it, just enough to keep the most identifying part of him out of America's permanent memory. In a world where reputation is leverage, where recognition is danger, and where perception can trigger investigations faster than any witness, that small decision wasn't vanity, it was strategy. And it raises the question that hangs over every power system once mass media enters the room. If a 5-second choice can change what the public believes it saw, how many other truths are just camera angles negotiated in silence? Because sometimes the most effective cover-up isn't hiding the crime, it's controlling the frame.